everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. My name is Rebecca Decker, and I'm going to be your host for this podcast. So for this first episode, I'm going to explain to you about how evidence-based birth began, and then after that, we will dive into some hot topics in the field of evidence-based maternity care. So I wanted to kick off this podcast by telling you the story of how evidence-based birth was born and where this movement came from. I think it's really important for you to know what my story is, and I've realized a lot of people don't actually know my story, so I'm excited to share it with you today. So as I already said, my name is Rebecca Decker, and I'm a nurse with my master's and PhD in nursing, and I live in Lexington, Kentucky, where I work full-time at Evidence-Based Birth, publishing research and making it available to the public. Before that, I was an assistant professor of nursing at a university, and I spent my work time teaching nursing students pathophysiology and pharmacology, and also doing clinical research. So I designed and led randomized trials and other types of studies, and I was really immersed in the world of research. But today I'm happy to tell you that I work at Evidence-Based Birth full-time, along with about 7 other team members. I have 3 children at the time I'm recording this. They are aged 9, 5, and 3 years old. And I'm married to the most amazing guy named Dan Decker, who is 100% supportive of what we do at Evidence-Based Birth. And he actually does a lot of work for EBB behind the scenes. When I was in graduate school for nursing, I was really immersed in the world of evidence-based practice. Research evidence was all that we talked about. We lived and breathed evidence, both in the research team that I was a part of, and also as I was teaching nursing students about evidence-based practice. So when I got pregnant, I was getting close to the end of my PhD program, and my husband and I were really looking forward to having our first baby. We took the hospital childbirth class, and I read a couple of books, but other than that, we didn't do very much preparation. Really, my goal was to be a, quote, good patient. I didn't want to make any waves. I wanted to do as I was told. I also wanted to be flexible because I knew that birth was unpredictable. So I kind of was like, well, if I need an epidural, I'll get one. If I don't need one, I won't get one. But other than that, I didn't really have any plans in my head for this birth. I really wanted to place 100% of my trust in the medical team and basically let them run the show. I also just really, really wanted to be seen as a good patient. I didn't want to be that kind of patient that the nurses talk about behind their back at the nurses' station. I wanted to be well liked by the nurses there. So what happened was my water broke at 39 and a half weeks. And so I took a shower and we headed to the hospital because that's what we had been told to do. If my water broke, I was told we would go to the hospital. When I got there, I was 2 centimeters dilated, but my contractions were already setting into a good pattern about every 5 to 7 minutes apart, so I went into labor on my own. Right from the very beginning, they recommended that I go on Pitocin, but because I was already having pretty good contractions that were frequent, I declined. After making it through triage, I got into my hospital room, and the nurse who dropped me off in the labor and delivery room said, go ahead and go to the bathroom right now because that's the last chance you'll have to use the bathroom while you're here, while you're in labor. And when I got back into bed, the nurse who was assigned to me came in and said, from now on, you have to use a bedpan. You're not allowed out of bed because your water has broke. They hooked me up to an IV and IV fluids, and I was told I was no longer allowed to eat or drink anything because I was in labor. And I was hooked up to all kinds of monitoring equipment and just basically left to lay there with my contractions. It was nighttime. My water had broken at 11 o'clock at night, and so I labored through the rest of the night like that. And in the morning, started getting pretty frequent visits to my room by residents who were continually pressuring me to start Pitocin, but I just felt like I didn't need it yet. Finally, after a lot of pressure, I gave in. I started the Pitocin, we started the epidural. I had some complications during the placement of the epidural. When I finally got to the point where it was time for me to push, I was fully dilated. I started feeling an urge to push. I was told that I was not allowed to push yet because everybody was in report. Unfortunately, I had become completely dilated right at 7 p.m. when everybody was in report, both the nurses and the residents. So I pushed my epidural button a couple of times because to help numb that feeling that I needed to push. So unfortunately, by the time everybody got there to help me push, I was too numb to push. The pushing stage ended up taking about 3 hours, and I will say that the one, truly evidence-based part of my experience was that my obstetrician never even brought up the fact that I might need a cesarean. She really believed in my ability to birth my baby, and she never even brought up the word cesarean. She had a lot of patience for me, and I think she was a little bit ahead of her time and more aware of the research on how long it might take for a first-time mom with an epidural to push. My baby was born, and they showed her to me briefly and then whisked her away for observation. And this was probably the hardest part of my birth story. I was healthy and my baby was healthy. There was really no good reason for her to separate us. And even though I wanted to be a good patient, at that point I knew that something was wrong because I knew intuitively you don't separate a healthy baby from a healthy mom. Your priorities should be on helping them establish breastfeeding and spending time together skin to skin. I kept asking for my baby over and over. They told me that she needed to be observed in the nursery. And then I was told later on, about 2 hours into our separation, when I asked again, they said, "Oh, we're so sorry. Her hair is wet. We just gave her a bath, so you have to wait for her hair to dry." When I look at pictures of my daughter in the nursery, in the isolette or warmer by herself, with no one even standing around observing her, I still think about those lost hours, those first few hours of her life, and how hard it must have been for her to be separated from me. And every time I tell this story when I speak at different places all around the United States, people start to tear up as I talk about this separation because it's happened to so many families in our country and across the world. My story is not just my own, it belongs to so many other people who had a similar experience of separation from their baby. After I got home from the hospital, I had a pretty rough recovery. I was pretty swollen. We call that edema from the IV fluids. I was really uncomfortable from that swelling and had a lot of trouble breastfeeding because of it. But overall, I will say I was pretty satisfied at the time. I really felt like I wouldn't have done anything differently. I was pretty happy with my care. It wasn't until about a year later that I really started processing what had happened to me and my family. And I began asking the question, what was the evidence for everything that happened to me? What was the evidence for not being allowed out of bed? What was the evidence for not being allowed to drink or eat or even have just a tiny sip of water? What was the evidence for all the monitors I was hooked up to and for separating me from my baby? Well, that I knew probably was not evidence-based because that just intuitively did not make sense. So basically what I did is I made a bullet point list of everything that happened to me, and I set a goal to personally look at the research on everything that happened. As I pulled the research, and there was a lot of research on these things, I was really surprised to find that almost everything that happened to me has been shown by research evidence to either be not helpful or to perhaps even be potentially harmful for healthy people giving birth to healthy babies. A couple years passed, and I had several miscarriages, which gave me a lot of time to think about the kind of birth I wanted to have the next time around when I would actually be able to carry a pregnancy to term and have a healthy baby. I decided to pursue the midwifery model of care because I felt like having a midwife would give me a better shot at some of the other evidence-based things that I wanted to have during my next birth. One of the most important things that I wanted is I didn't want to have to fight for evidence-based care. I wanted it to be the routine. I wanted it to be a given, just something that happened to me without me having to request it. It was a lot harder than you might think to find a midwife in Kentucky. Even though Kentucky is the birthplace of nurse midwifery in the United States, there's a huge shortage of practicing midwives here. My husband and I managed to find a midwife who we trusted, and we found that she truly believed in helping inform me about my options. And she also stressed that I was the decision maker and she was there to simply help support and inform my decision making. With my son's birth, it was completely the opposite of when my daughter was born. From the very beginning, I was respected. I was the one making the decisions. Evidence-based care was the standard, and I didn't experience any pressure or coercion. I was also never separated from him after birth. There's 2 quick stories I want to tell you about his birth. The first is that after he was born, I asked the midwife, when do we give him a bath? And I'll never forget this. She said, Rebecca, he's your baby. You can give him a bath whenever you want. And I was like, you're right. He is my baby. I do get to make these kinds of decisions. It was that very decision, when does your child get their first bath, that was taken away from me in my first birth and was given back to me by my midwife at my second birth. The second quick story is about my son's weight. So when my son was born, everyone was trying to guess how much he weighed. My first child, my daughter, was 6 pounds, 8 ounces. This baby was obviously bigger. He looked pretty chunky. I think the biggest guess came from my brother-in-law, who guessed 8 pounds, 10 ounces. Then my midwife weighed him, and we discovered that he weighed 9 pounds, 2 ounces. And I was like, I did that? My body did that? I know it's cliche, but I've heard a lot of people say after giving birth, if I can do that, I can do anything. For me, this was really true. I was literally infused through my fingertips with that feeling of power that I could do whatever I put my mind to. A few months later, while he was still a newborn, I was invited to speak with a group of physicians and residents who were trying to learn more about the midwifery model of care. And they invited me to talk about my 2 very different birth experiences. They also mentioned, hey, we're always looking for research evidence to inform our practice. If you have any research about your birth experiences, please feel free to bring it along. So I made up about 3 or 4 one-page handouts. Afterwards, they were like, we love these handouts. Can we have more? And I had an aha moment. I thought, if these physicians can find these handouts so helpful about the evidence, how many other people could? So I came home that night and I Googled evidence-based care during labor and delivery. I found a couple of websites, but nobody seemed to be doing it the way I envisioned that it could be done. So I told Dan, I'm starting a blog, and he's like, okay. And I started searching for domain names. I still wish I had that list of website names that I brainstormed. But evidence-based birth seemed perfect. So I started posting my first articles. They were basically reviews of the research that I had already collected while I was preparing for my second baby's birth. And I thought, wow, what if I could inspire 10 people to find evidence-based care? I would be so happy if 10 people ever visited my website. After a few months, I was continually surprised by the statistics. The number of visitors to the website was doubling every month. It was like exponential growth. I also started getting emails from people all over the world. Leaders in the field started reaching out to me. I was able to work with improvingbirth.org and volunteered on their board of directors for a while. Every time I posted an article, it would go viral. Within a few months, I realized that this was going to be a huge website. So I basically decided to raise my standards. I sat down and made a list of quality control mechanisms I would use for my articles, and I started recruiting people to peer review my articles. OBs, physicians, midwives, researchers, scientists, they all volunteered to help review my articles. So I started Evidence-Based Birth in 2012, and over the past years, I've just been continually awed by how everyone has responded to this project. I really feel like we're all in this together. And every time I dive into a new topic, I really look at it with fresh eyes. I think it helps that I don't have a background in obstetric nursing because I don't have any underlying biases. I was never indoctrinated into any one way of doing things. I truly just want to learn the facts and then share the facts with other people. And that was Dan, my husband's contribution. From the very beginning, he said, Rebecca, just stick to the facts. You can't give people your opinion. You have to take your opinion out of this and only just look at the evidence. So I started using a technique that I had learned in my PhD program. It's called framing. It helps me recognize my underlying biases before I start a research project, so that by keeping them in mind, I can work as hard as I can to avoid that bias sneaking into my work. My hope was that evidence-based birth would become a trusted resource where people could get no fluff, just the facts, information about hot topics in the birth field. But also from the very beginning, one of my goals is to help people dialogue and have conversations with their care providers and professionals in their life about the information that is posted on evidence-based birth. We're going to talk more about what evidence-based care is made up of in the next session, But one of those things, one of the legs of what I call the three-legged stool of evidence-based care is your care provider's clinical expertise. As the person giving birth or the family who's having a baby, you really need someone to help you interpret the evidence and make sure it applies to you. Each of you is so unique, and you need that expert guidance to help you figure out whether evidence applies to your unique situation. So in the next episode, I want to talk about what is evidence-based care. Is it a certain way of giving birth? Is it a checklist? What is evidence-based care and what is it not? So I'm looking forward to talking to you again shortly about evidence-based care and what it really means. Thanks for listening. Bye.